Avenue conversation, that's what we heard from property owners who were interested in asking for more FAR, and a little more height and possibly higher unit count. So what I wanted to, what I appreciated was the conversation about where have we been, and taking a little bit of step back into history. I sent you the other night a great breakdown that my staff had done. Allison and Jeff and Brooks had put together about looking at actual mixed-use development projects in our own community, not even outside of Winter Park. And so I've given you a number of examples in here. A lot of these examples go back 10 years or more. During the original development of the comprehensive plan between 1984 and 2006, we had a much more open FAR, we had a much more open height, we had much more open density. So a lot of the projects that you see today that are completed and have kind of become iconic in Winter Park have been there since that time, because there wasn't the comprehensive plan restrictions or the restrictions in placement that there is today.
Would you give me an example of what that is?
Right, and I'm happy to. So Hannibal Square, because I'm going to lean a lot on Hannibal Square today. Hannibal Square was originally developed in the mid to late 90s. If you go kind of, and I'll use the overhead kind of for a lot of this, I'll put it there now. And you can bear with me in a lot of OMO work. But I think you've got most of it in front of you. So looking at the Hannibal Square project, which is right now has a CBD land use and is got a zoning category of C2, we were really interested in looking at the breakdown of Hannibal Square on that. And I mean, I've never learned how to make the new one work.
Don't have to now.
No. Zoom is up here. Zoom is where? Zoom is here. All right. So, and you guys have this, you have this in your package, so for the audience, just so that they, so when we look at Hannibal Square, I want to go back to what this looks like. So in Hannibal Square, the overall Hannibal Square FAR, including the garage, is about 176%. By block, the biggest block in Hannibal Square is the block where Dexter's is located, and that's got an FAR of about 146% FAR. So when we start to look at Hannibal Square, and I don't know anybody who could go through Hannibal Square and say, this doesn't feel like Winter Park. It isn't Park Avenue, it was never intended to be. I don't think we want to design anything that is Park Avenue-ish. I think we want to design something that complements Winter Park's look and feel, but you don't want to ever try to recreate something that's been around since 1886, 87. So I'll leave that up for just a second. So Commissioner, with regard to looking at that, I think Hannibal Square is a really good example of how this was developed before we implemented CBD land use and C2 zoning districts, and we're able to really work through a process that was successful. One of the caveats that Hannibal Square, that made Hannibal Square work, that I think that I would recommend that you consider is the fact that, I'm going to leave that up and I'll come back to the table, is the fact that Hannibal Square was developed with a true master plan. The developer, the landowner at that point, out of his pocket paid Andres Dewani, who's a world-renowned architect, to come in and create an entire master plan. And when we look at this master plan, if you guys remember back to Ravadaj and so forth, there's a huge packet of information on Ravadaj that sets everything out. It sets out setbacks and facade and street size. That's what this did for these blocks. And I like the concept of a master plan for an area, because I think it helps, it provides a comfort level to the commission and to the community that they know what's going to go there. And then I think it also provides a comfort level to the developer and the landowner that they understand your expectations before they come in the door with a building. So one of the things that I would recommend that you all consider is in any spot you're going to do mixed use. And I think mixed use should be very controlled in Winter Park. I think it should be by corridor, not necessarily a standalone land use that could just be put anywhere. I think if you're going to do this, that it would be well worth the city's time and investment to create master plans for those corridors. Just as we were talking about Orange Avenue, but to really take it an extra step and work with the landowners and the property owners along that corridor to create that look and feel that everyone is satisfied with. And there's a lot of give and take on that, and it will take some time and effort, but the thought of that becomes doable with what we've said we like about Winter Park. And with that, and I know I'm talking a lot, but I'm going to get into the thought of an overlay to a district. And I'm going to go back to that, Elmo, because I want to use Orange Avenue really as my example. And I'm using Orange because, as you recall, last October, we presented you some outline with regard to Orange as a corridor. And we started out with really looking at, who are the large property owners. Brooks did a wonderful rendering to look at this corridor, show the property owners, and come up and capture some ideas of what the Orange Avenue corridor should look like. So when we start to talk about a district to an overlay, the closest thing that I could think of with regard to looking at a district, and again, I think from a standpoint of kind of laying it all out there, I don't know necessarily that mixed use needs to be an individual land use classification that anybody can get anywhere in the city. I think that's a bad idea. I think that is kind of allows too much free-for-all, and I don't think you'd be happy with that. But I think if you looked at Orange Avenue as Orange Avenue, I'm going to use this.
I think, Dory, though, in our case, you're saying that, right? Mixed use from an individual, given the parameters of the city, given our growth, given where we are as a city, it's not a good idea. But in other areas, it's
right. In other areas, it's fine. But given the desire to make sure that the mixed use gives back as much as it takes, I think looking at it in that perspective is something. So Dan, I'm glad Dan is here because he mentioned this morning that he did an overlay with the city of Winter Garden. And so one of the things about doing an overlay actually sits on top of your existing land use categories. So I'm going to use this black marker, and I know we have architects and urban designers, so bear with me, I'm not you. I can barely draw a straight line, as you'll soon see. So I think that if you thought about Orange Avenue, and this is just really drafty, and if you drew a line around Orange, much as Brooks did in his design plan, and you said, you know what, we're going to create something on top of the land use category, on top of it. We're going to create an overlay on top of it that's going to follow a master plan design book and also give incentives as well as talk about exactly what we want. And as property owners in this corridor would come in, they would ask permission through a comprehensive planning process to trigger the overlay, to trigger the mixed use overlay, and then there would be entitlements to that they could negotiate, but there would also be regulations and incentives and requirements back to the city to consider for consideration for the entire corridor. This also, if you think about Orange Avenue being an overlay, It also allows you as the city commission to really consider the improvements, the bigger set of improvements that need to go on Orange Avenue and how you negotiate those. So in the course of looking at Orange Avenue, some of the things we've heard, and I know you've heard this, is parking, 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 parking. We've heard drainage, we've heard sidewalks, we've heard landscaping, but we go back to parking, parking, parking. When you create a overlay like this and then accompany it with a master planning document, you really have the chance to play in a bigger sandbox. You have the chance to pull everybody in and say, here's what we want. Now, how much of this are you willing to give us? And when they're willing to actually work with the city, then they maybe get more entitlements out of the process. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's something that staff would recommend that you consider. I haven't gone as far as getting into FAR and lot size, but the interesting thing about an overlay to a district is that if you have a property owner on Orange Avenue who never wants to redevelop, who never wants to engage into that discussion about the incentives for redeveloping, their land use category, whether it's office or commercial, would never be impacted. They would continue to have their land use, they would continue to have their zoning district they have today. It's really a very, it's really an opportunity to get folks who want to come in and incentivize themselves and get you to negotiate with them to be able to pull that trigger. If you do a land use category, a separate land use category, you really, as you well know, you really do give up some control over looking at a more distributed area, and you really deal with each piece by piece. Hannibal Square works because of that master plan, because it's also had 20 years of development, and because there was a master developer that did that over all of that. Here on Orange Avenue and on any other corridor, you've got a lot of individual property owners. So my counsel would be to consider the fact that the city really needs to take the lead in creating the plan that these developers want. And that includes things like height and FAR and block size and parking. So, you know, I've talked a lot and I apologize, but I tried to hit on that because I know that that was a topic of discussion. An overlay from a regulatory standpoint is easy. And Dan, feel free to pipe in with anything. It's much easier because we're not going out and we're not having to do an administrative land use change to all the property owners or an administrative rezoning. We're just offering that overlay for property owners to use at their will, at their desire, with the control coming from the city. So it's an overlay concept for Winter Park is a little bit different, but the best analogy I can get, and I realize this might rub salt in a few wounds, is the medical arts district. The medical arts district encompasses more than one property. It allows the distribution of FAR over a wider area of property. It controls land uses and it controls uses that are within there. We don't allow residential within the medical arts district. But it is in essence an overlay. It is in essence a bigger district than just a simple land use, right? And I think that that was a big part of the discussion we had when we were talking about medical arts. So, kind of to kind of finish off the Orange Avenue conversation and shut up for a while because I'm sure you'd like that. I would really suggest that you take Orange Avenue as the test case. And I would suggest that, and I said this in my memo, that you consider bringing on an urban designer to work with the city, to work with the property owners, all the property owners, and really create a master plan, a true master plan that talks about setbacks, it talks about design standards, it talks about height, it talks about block length, it talks about parking. And you really work and put together a master plan. I would also recommend that you consider developing policies in the comp plan for Orange Avenue alone as a mixed use. Take each quarter individually. You know, I've always told you that the comp plan does not have to be carved in stone. It should be fluid. It should be your document that is, as times change and as situations change, that you're able to go into amendments, this would be a great opportunity to create a mixed-use overlay or a district, whatever you want to call it, simply for Orange Avenue after you've done the master plan, after you've set the standards, and then create a zoning code to go with it, but only do Orange Avenue. Don't take a bigger bite of that apple than you need to. I would recommend you start with Orange, see if you like it, see if you get takers, see if you can work through the negotiation process before you do something citywide and do it on Fairbanks, do it on Lee, do it on anywhere else, and just give yourself that opportunity to take one piece at a time. Are there any questions about overlays to districts? And I realize you may have feelings about land use categories, but.
I do have a question. It's very clear to me how you would encourage people that were getting greater density, greater height to buy into a master plan. How do you deal, in order to make it balanced, let's say Dan's Ravadage, 100% floor area ratio. So early in the process, Dan had control over where he put the 1 stories and where he was going to put the 7 stories. How do you talk a property owner into being the one that gets the 1 story when everyone else is getting the 7 story? That's right.
I think if the city takes the lead in developing the master plan,
Right.
it has to be an agreed upon document.
Because
So-
who would ever agree to take the lesser density to allow his brother to have the higher density?
But I think it's a matter of what you think of as far as height. I think that if you're going to look at height, it's very easy for the city to say, you know what, I don't want 5 stories all the way along Orange Avenue, because you don't want 5 stories on Orange Avenue. You may want height at 1790, you may want some height at 1792 in Orange. You may allow some height at Fairbanks, but the stuff in the middle, the city gets to say. Now, so as a property owner, you can either live with the fact that the city says, you know, we're going to give you 2 stories or 3 stories, because that's how we feel it works, or you can choose never to implement that mixed use and take advantage of redevelopment. So you have to be fair about the fact that the corridor, as the city, it is the city's responsibility to, I believe, let the community know what that corridor needs to look like. So at that point, it's the city's responsibility to decide through discussions what heights can be bared along that corridor. I think the surprise will be, you're going to have people who never want to redevelop on Orange. Some of those lots are very narrow, some of those lots are not very wide, and some of those people are very content with what they have. So you may not get a lot of redevelopment. But I think it's up to the city, just as we already have done along through our height map and through our other areas, just to look at this master plan and set those heights. And I believe that the only way this works is if you do engage the property owners, and there is some, if not, you know, I always feel that it's compromised, that nobody gets everything they want, but people are pretty comfortable at the end of the day getting more than they have.
Peter?
Dan, there's a lot of understandable angst about opening doors to things that are bigger than currently exists. What are I wanted to get a clarification of the overlay concept legally in terms of what it really gives a potential property owner in terms of any rights at all, if any at all. Because I don't think it gives them any. I think it, for example,
Gives them the opportunity for
yeah, Mr. Bellows did it all himself, and he came to the city with his plan that he paid for, and the commission at that time said, go for it, right? That's basically what happened, Mr. Bellows?
Wasn't quite that easy. It was a little more painful for him.
Well, the city administratively in '95 amended the comp plan. The city did that, that opened the door to allow.
My point is this, there's one property owner who, at the west end of Orange Avenue at 1792, who already owns a significant piece of land. They could, in theory, hire their own planner, present the city with a document and say, we'd like to change everything in the comprehensive plan to address our plan. The advantage, it seems to me, and the city has no obligation to even react to that now, right? One, and thinking longer term, not just our presence on the commission, but 5, 10 years from now, because this is a very long-term proposition. If we, the city, define what the limits are in the corridor, a future commission is not going to be faced with somebody saying, hey, I want to do 3 times what you currently allow on my property on Orange Avenue, because there's already a standard set and a precedent set in terms of what the limits are. So to some extent, the long-term planning context can be beneficial to the ordered development over time. And I'm trying to figure out if there are any legal aspects. Does the city put itself in any kind of position at all by creating an overlay, let's say on Orange Avenue alone, in terms of being presumed to be willing to accept anything that comes from a developer that meets the requirements of the overlay?
Well, an overlay zoning is a zoning tool that's a legislative tool. And just about every ordinance you pass, there's always a give and take with property rights and people who want to develop and having flexibility versus having the city impose sort of its vision on the property owner. So there's a number of different types of overlay districts. If your concern is we're trying to impose something that's not flexible, then one thing you could do as policymakers is make it more flexible, or allow the property owner a process where here's the vision of a master plan, but we won't necessarily hold you to that. Or you can provide a very specific set of parameters in the legislation that requires the form of the building, the setbacks, exactly what the city wants. So there's a give and take. And as policymakers, you're faced with those issues all the time.
Let me restate the question. Okay, let's say we have that very carefully defined, and somebody comes in and says, I'm the contract purchaser of 7 acres along Orange Avenue, and I want to do exactly what is in your overlay. Does the commission at that time have an obligation to approve that? Obviously it has an obligation to hear it.
Well, just
Depends on how it's written.
yeah, I mean, if you have a set of criteria like you would in any rezoning context, or if you've already designated a property with an overlay and they're coming in with at that point, they already have the zoning approval and everything they need, they come in with a site plan, let's say, and it meets every single aspect of the zoning requirements and the setback or the site plan approval requirements. At that point, the city's looking for a technical review. And if the applicant meets all the standards of the city code at that point, then the answer is that it's supposed to be approved. However, I mean, if one reviews the site plan and determines that as a commission or any board that's reviewing it, that it doesn't meet a certain land development code criteria, including an overlay district requirement, then that application could be denied. Now, I'll just back up and say, the comp plan amendment stage is where you as a commission have the most flexibility to say no to a property owner, because at that point, you're being asked to change the legislative document of the city. And so, at that point, you have the most discretion to set policy. And as you get further down in the development review and approval process, when you get down to the building permit stage, you lose the ability to say no if that's your desire, because at that point in the process, the property owner has been presumed to have met your requirements of the comp plan, your land development code, maybe an overlay district, whatever's in the process. So if that's sort of what you're asking about, your flexibility in approving or not approving, it depends on where you are in the process of the development and also what the criteria of the code are. Any quasi-judicial decision that you make, you have to review an application for conformance with the criteria in your land development code. If they meet those criteria, then you are supposed to.
I understand that. I asked what I thought was a comprehensive plan question. Let's assume that there's an overlay for Orange Avenue, and it says, and it's fairly specific, the height shall be Y, and the residential density shall be X, and the number of residential units, less than 1,000 square feet is Z, and it's very specific in terms of, what the city wants to see. If somebody comes in, presuming that they're willing to comply with all the land development code requirements underneath that, if they come in with a project within that overlay district that meets the strict criteria set out by the city for the overlay, what is the city's flexibility?
Well, unless you have a criteria in your code that presents to you certain flexibility in objective criteria form, then if they meet every objective criteria that you have laid out for approval, then you're supposed to grant approval. If they don't, then you deny. Now, in the comp plan standpoint, if they just say, we meet the comp plan requirements, that alone is not enough.
I understand.
They have to then meet the very specific criteria of the land development.
What's your concern, Peter?
It's not a concern. I'm trying to get on the table the fear factor that I think we all share in terms of how much do we want to allow and what circumstances for what reasons. And I'm trying to create an understanding of the legal context within which we put words on a piece of paper that then have to be responded to.
So I think that's, as I said before, that a lot of that stuff is depending upon how this overlay district, whatever we want to call it, is written, right? So I think that's probably somewhere down the road. But I think what we're looking at today, and Dory, I think that makes a lot of sense to focus on one area to see, we can get caught up in a whole bunch of different, discussions based on geography within the city. But what really hit me, Sarah, was what you said a few commission meetings ago, where you said, shouldn't everybody have the opportunity, shouldn't every neighborhood have the opportunity to have a Hannibal Square or something like that? This area specifically has that opportunity because we have 3 major property owners, north, south, central, who control a fairly large swath of that property.
You're including us in that, right?
I am, yeah, in the center. We have the city in the center, we have down south in the middle. And if we don't take this opportunity to view this and master plan this corridor, we're going to be kicking ourselves, or somebody's going to be kicking us down the road. Okay, I mean, this is, you mentioned Ramadan, we mentioned Hannibal Square, we have 1 property owner. Granted, that's a heck of a lot easier way to go about it. However, we do have the city who can help master plan this. And I think the other property owners are looking for direction. They've come for the last year and said, tell us what we can do here. We want to do something. We want this to work for the city. How can this work? And if we sit here and say, God, you know what, just build based on what you're allowed to build, we're going to have a strip center to the north, a strip center to the south, and we're going to have something in the middle that we're not going to be happy with.
And potentially somebody bringing a master plan of their own, as Dan did for there, that
For a small little portion.
Yeah.
So we have an opportunity to create another area in the city, Park Avenue, Hannibal Square. Even 1792 has its own little flavor now. It's not Park Avenue, it's on Hannibal Square, but some people I know love 1792 because it's a funkier little thing for them. And I think that's, we should have the opportunity to create little different districts within Winter Park. And so I'd love the opportunity to continue the discussion where the city takes the lead, working with the property owners along the entire building. Because as we've talked about too, it's not just, Carolyn, to your point, well, you've given them 100% FAR, 200% FAR, whatever. Throw a FAR number out, throw this number out, throw that number out. I'm not that interested in numbers. I think we're all interested in what this thing looks like and how it works in the future. But there's a lot of people along that corridor who have no water retention, who have no parking. So there's not going to be redevelopment. There's not going to be anything that's going to be allowed to happen in those areas. And those people need some relief too. So somebody may not want to go to 2 stories. Someone may not want increased density. Someone may not want different aspects of it. But what they're going to need by city code is for any redevelopment to happen is to take care of their water. And they don't have the land to take care of their water. So there's ways to address it. And I think we should be thinking a little bit big picture. Peter, you mentioned yesterday during the commission meeting the opportunity to look at the garage on New England as a strategic future and thinking strategically about it. And if this is the same opportunity to me. If we don't start thinking strategically and acting strategically, it's always great to think strategically. Fortunately, we never get to act strategically. And this is a unique opportunity, and we should be moving forward that way. So That's my little 2 cents. Sarah, if you want to.
Only because I enter the city that way every day.
Yeah.
And because I enter that city, this city that way every day, I want it to make a statement for anyone else entering the city that way. And I do think everybody wants that. And as I drive by there, I see so much more pedestrian traffic. I see all these people out. So I think what I'm hearing is that we would develop or have someone help us develop an overlay, which is the mechanism by which we could see our first almost ever mixed-use development that's planned in this manner. And I'm not into numbers and FAR right now. What I'm into is, can we move this process forward so that we can create another community? Because quite frankly, I came by where we're going to build, or perhaps build a big garage this morning, and I thought, I don't want to see that, okay? So I want to be able to, the longer I sit here, the more I know that in 5 or 10 years, I want to drive through this community and think that while I was there, we made this happen. That's why you sit up here. So I'd love to see us make something happen there that would be a great entrance into our community. And I don't know what that is. I know this is a mechanism by which we can do that. I know that we've talked around this, and I don't think everybody at this table really wants this. I have wanted it because I have a child who studied under this gentleman who wrote this, and he just thinks that he, is the second God. And so because of that, I also know the feeling people have, and that's really, me, I'm going to be all about feeling. I want that
You're
feeling.
mushy like that.
I am mushy like that, but I want the feeling that I get and I feel when I see that. And we are very responsible for that with the rules we establish. So if we can do that with an overlay, then I think the recommendation for staff is to see how we can move forward.
Mr. Seidel? A little late, Mr. Seidel?
Don't say the late, Mr. Seidel.
It's already. Sorry.
You guys are all just early. I'm not sure
That's my dad.
When we look at land use changes and, we look at things that come before us as a commission, I think we could probably look at just 3 main items that people are concerned about, right? They're concerned about increased traffic, they're concerned about lots of green space, and they're concerned about the height of the structures, right? And we really don't get into a lot of the other stuff, but if you talk, so to me, if we can identify what the main concerns are and really just define what we want from those main concerns, getting into, and did you see the email from Craig Diamond there?
Yes, I
forwarded to
did.
you? Okay. So one of the guys that works for us he's in all this planning and just went to a big seminar on this, and the Sierra Club's actually looking at it because it helps stop development outside in the rural areas, right? So if we can take those things that we're concerned about and just, for example, a height map. So if we produce a height map that everyone's comfortable with, and we say, okay, this doesn't bother me, if this is this high, this doesn't bother me, if this is this high, and this is what makes sense, then let the development figure out what goes in there. That is, with regards to the FAR and all those other items, if you can only build in a certain space, you can only put what you can put in that space. But then from the traffic perspective, how do we assign the trips? And that's based on the mixed use. And so to me, if we can really focus on the things that bother people about redevelopment, because there's a lot of positives about it, but what are the things that people really get up in arms about, and because we hear it all the time. Let's focus on those and how do we make those things work with it, and then just kind of leave the rest up to the urban planners like we talked about. Like if we want to have a corridor that has a trail through there, we should figure out what we think that corridor should be, but we should allow them to change the entrance and exit points across their property. It's just, this is what we're looking to have. And so just kind of define those big picture things, but not get into the minutia on each of the properties. We just let the current codes, if they want to develop with those, but then they've got to work within that box that we've said, this is what you have. And I don't know from a traffic numbers, I did meet with Rick Baldacci, and he kind of showed me some of the interesting things about the traffic numbers. So is that something we need to have in there about?
I think that should be a piece of the master plan. I think that as you look at a master plan, you need to evaluate all points. You need to evaluate, but even before a project comes in, you should look at how you're gonna move people. It's not about moving the car, it's about how you're gonna move people, it's how you're gonna provide that flow. And so that should be part of the master planning process. I apologize for interrupting, I just wanted to.
Yeah, no.
I think that we all get caught on what we have right now. I think the ability to look a little broader and to look a little higher and go, well, maybe if we shift and close and move that roadway network, maybe that provides access behind rather than in front, takes traffic off Orange. That should be all part of the master plan or
Right.
process.
And then to mention the stormwater, Mr. Mayor, that you spoke about, for example, you know, I believe the area is a sandy ridge. Subterranean drainage, you don't necessarily need to treat the quantity that you normally would because most storms aren't that big. So I think there can be some flexibility because currently we have no drainage on those buildings like you were talking about. But if you were to treat just say a half inch on those properties and do it subterranean and not require them to meet the code, which is an inch, you're now getting something where you had nothing. And for the most part, most of that's going to go back into the ground, which helps with the aquifer.
Listen, agreed, and that's where I think that conversation
like
needs to be
that.
had, rather than just strictly, well, the code says you need to have blah, 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 blah. There needs to be that further discussion. The one thing I would say though too, and this is kind of to Dory's point and your points, is I would like to personally start from a bigger, broader, opportunistic perspective. What do we want to see, and then I think we have to take into account, Commissioner, the
Well, when you say
opportunities, hang on one second, the negatives, and the people coming in saying, I'm worried about height, I'm worried about traffic, I'm worried. I don't want to start with the warriors. I want to start with the dreamers. I want to start with the people who are adding and saying, here's what we can have. And then we can go backward and say, okay, now where are the negatives, what are we going to run into? But I don't think, no developer, no artist, no genius, no creator, no innovator ever said, all right, well, I can't do this. They say, let's start at the top, let's start with what we're trying to get done, and then we'll factor in the negatives as a part of it. I'm sorry, Commissioner.
Well, when you say what we want, like the five of us, that's what I'm getting.
As representatives for the city, yes.
That's our job.
Just a representative form of government. So yes,
Yeah,
what the
it's our
city
job.
wants for this corridor, and we have an opportunity with the three major property owners to get together to say, here's what this corridor could be for the city, yeah.
Right, see me, I'd rather have the people with the visions figure that out.
Well, that's why we're
You do
hiring,
have
that's,
vision.
Right.
You have to have vision in this corridor.
and that's why Dory is also talking about getting a planner involved, because it's not what I do. But I want to turn loose the people that do this and engage the major property owners who can make this come to fruition.
And I would add to that, Mayor, I mean, each of us has a sense of what we think Winter Park is and should be. And at some point, we need to start talking about some of the details at the large scale, details to provide a context upon which a master plan can be built by a planner.
That's part of the process, absolutely.
And, you know, I've got a million ideas on that subject. I'm willing to talk about it an hour later.
Not now.
Well, isn't there the, what's the association on Orange Avenue that paid for all the landscape? Is that all the property owners got together?
It was a special assessment.
Yeah.
It's still ongoing.
It was a special.
Right, but everybody, like, there's a vote to make that happen.
Right.
Yes.
So there's an organization of all the property owners.
No, we just.
No, there was a Orange Avenue merchants or something. There was some
I
organization.
don't know
that
if
got-
they still exist.
They don't,
today,
they don't.
but-
They're still, it's loosely banded
Right.
together, but it's not official. But they did vote, and there was a organization. Commissioner Cooper, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. The email that I got said that you were interested in knowing what I think, what my qualifications are, and what my concerns are.
Well, you got the wrong email. We're really not.
I'm going to tell you anyway. I think that shared stormwater, shared parking, shared drainage issues all make sense. I mean, it's what Winter Park has always been. Winter Park Village has all of those things, and it has it at a human scale that's quite comfortable for most of the residents. I've never heard any complaints in that regard. when I looked through what you gave us, it talked about moving beyond the 60% FAR, increasing height beyond the 3 stories, and centralized parking. It also talked about, from our perspective, what staff was hoping to see. And I see that to be improved infrastructure beyond individual properties, which is certainly something that I would advocate for. Increased open space, which is certainly something I'd advocate for, and redevelopment of the commercial corridors. All those are positive things. Then you asked about what my thoughts regarding the Park Avenue and Hannibal Square and the success that has come with that. And so for me, when I look at that, I think the success of Park Avenue and Hannibal Square comes from significant open space, like Shady Park, like Central Park. That's what makes Park Avenue and Hannibal Square, in addition to some issues on human scale height. And the biggest one, I believe, in Andre Duane's plan showed alleys, service alleys. It showed human scale blocks. The reason the developments don't feel overwhelming is because of the block size. And even the SMART code lays out block sizes. And without that, we get Lake Lily. And I don't think many Winter Park residents are interested in Lake Lily, and I don't think they're interested in many more paseos. I don't think those things are going to fly. But I think heights, small block sizes or small building lot sizes, and brick streets and human scale is important. When you say qualifications, for me, before I would be comfortable considering giving up any density or height or intensity of land use, I would want to see significant parcels broken down to human scale buildable lots. I would like to see service alleys. I'd like to see significant green space, because I think that's what makes Hannibal Square and Park Avenue work. And I think the heights up next to these major corridors, if you're going to master plan, the heights need to start at 1 and 2 stories, and that height needs to be back off these corridors, not closing people in like canyons. I
How do you
also,
feel about that 45-degree angle line?
Yeah.
Talked about on Park
it's a
Avenue.
very classical sort of architectural. By the way, architectural review is significant. It's significant and it is necessary. We could make terrible mistakes here. What I heard you say is that when we write it down and we define it, we're locked in. They are allowed to do whatever it is we define. So we better make damn sure we define something that this community has visioned and said to us that we want. And that's critical. I mean, to me, it's just critical. Those words are so important. We can't, I don't want to see us do anything in a global fashion. I would really like not only for this to be only one area, but a pilot program, not a long-term change to our codes and a commitment, but a pilot program to test for the community to see how the community reacts.
Is
I've
that
seen
what
that.
she suggested, just
Yes.
do this in one area?
I think we're all.
Well,
We're all
no,
on that
there's a
same
difference.
page.
Right.
There's a difference.
I just want to clarify that, because that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about creating rules that you can pick up. Everybody said the same thing,
No.
and take anywhere. This is an Orange Avenue issue for
But
an
that-
overlay.
But I didn't mean it as a pilot. I think you wanted
Right,
as
I'm
a
just- I'm
temporary
just saying,
thing.
You
how-
can't put
let's
up a
talk
building and
about-
call it a pilot
Right.
building, come
I
on.
want to finish because I want to get to my concerns, but I really would like for us to talk about, I have read many codes where they say very clearly, this is pilot, this is not creating entitlements across the community, this is pilot. But anyway, my concern is what I hear from the residents is a plea that we protect their small scale intensity in this town, human scale, lots of green space, and I hear that constantly. Don't destroy the character, keep low density. For me, I'm more interested in a horizontal mixed use than I am a vertical mixed use. Overbuilding multifamily is a huge concern of mine. Look up and down the Sunrail corridor to see what you see.
Nobody's going there.
No, I'm sure, she asked me what are my
Hello.
concerns. She asked me what are my concerns.
Whether they're relative or real or not.
Whether, yeah, of course, they would be irrelevant and not real, but I think that as you look up and down the Sunrail corridor, what you'll see is, and if you read Globe articles written by Paul Ellis, what you will read is that there's a real opportunity that we are overbuilding multifamily. And I don't want to leave Winter Park ever with that kind of a boneyard. I don't think we need to do that. We do not have a need to increase our revenues to the point where we destroy our character. And so for me, that's real critical, and I'm sure it is for most people here. My concerns, though, are traffic congestion, school overcrowding, unnecessary density, large buildings too close to roadways, and a lack of an equitable quid pro quo when it comes to what am I getting for what I am giving. So for me, that balance is critical, and I don't want to create any entitlements that I have to deal with in the future that I cannot take back. So if there's a way to do it as a pilot and let it be a test for Winter Park, I'd certainly like to do. And those are my thoughts, qualifications, and concerns.
Tori, next steps.
Can I ask you a quick question, the question you just asked? I mean, I understood that the zoning is staying the same, except we have an overlay. So if you want to do something with the overlay,
We
you've got,
haven't actually decided to do it,
what we're talking about, you would have to work within the parameters of the overlay,
but right.
which would be giving some more entitlements, but it's also going to be what you had asked about, or said with regards to balancing.
Defining.
Would be granting the opportunity for some entitlements,
Right.
For that area.
not giving up, not giving entitlements, let's be clear.
Right, so, so, I'm just trying to understand your point. At the end of the day, because this is one of those things, okay, so if the intent is to have a larger structure, with say with more units in it, you're looking for them to offset that with something. And so at the end of the day, they're,
Equitable.
right.
You know,
Right.
we created a draft, and this was internal, and we had kicked around the idea that to be able to increase your development entitlements, there was a point system, which was, you know, you give us green space, you get a little more floor area ratio, you give us pedestrian access, you get a little more floor area ratio, to the point where you would then kind of hit the top of whatever that cap would be. I think it would be an interesting exploration as the city moves through this process, and I think that that's what Dan has done in Winter Garden, where it's an incentive-based program. We're going to incentivize, we're going to give you the incentives to do more, but there's going to be a need on property owners and folks who want to redevelopment's part to be able to either be part and parcel to bigger improvements or to go out to do more for what that community basis is. That's always been, from a staff's perspective, that's always been the intention as we move forward, that it's not, that the negotiations need to be handled up front and early and not settled when you all are at the dais looking at a site plan. That's what I really want to get out of the way. We've talked about, and I think through going through a master plan process with this or anything else, the ability for you all to be able to react and look at things early is really important. I've talked about, Jeff and I were kicking around the idea of adding an extra step, which is, you know, a real bubble plan for properties that are interested in looking at this.